I once heard someone compare AI writing to taxidermy, and it's always kind of stuck in my head. AI writing has this surface level fluency that looks convincing, but once you actually start reading it, you can tell it's not human. It has this uncanny feel to it, so it confuses me when I see people defend it.
AI increases my creativity because I get to focus on advanced techniques that AI simply cannot
We need
do.
to stop using buzzwords like stealing and replace it with the proper factual word inspiration. AI gets inspiration from other works, just like humans do. If AI is stealing, then everyone is stealing. These are the cold, hard facts.
My AI writing process is a bit unique. I like to be in control of the story, so I start by writing a detailed scene myself. Then I use Gemini Advanced 1.5 Pro to flesh it out and add some flair. Gemini is great for quickly generating content, but it tends to overuse certain phrases and adverbs. That's where Claude 3.5 Sonnet comes in. I use it to refine Gemini's output, removing unnecessary repetition and polishing the language. What's really cool is that Sonnet works within the context of my entire manuscript and character profiles using a project, so I was able to make the scene truly come alive.
How many years before AI can write better than the best fantasy authors?
Hopefully soon.
From a prose standpoint, not long. But good writing is more than prose.
Oh, these? Where did I find them? Look no further than The Nerdy Novelist, a YouTube channel by author James Hamilton dedicated to writing fiction with AI. We'll call him Nerdy for short. He popped up on my radar when I found this book. Damn, an AI book on Amazon? Never seen one of those before. Obviously, it doesn't stand out much, so what piqued my interest? Two things, actually. First, he claims to have the biggest AI channel for fiction writers. No idea how true that is, but we'll go with it for this video. We're not just talking about an AI writer, we're talking about the one with the biggest channel. Second, it gave me a feel for how someone who uses AI thinks, and in some ways, it's not what I expected. Now, we've all heard the arguments that using AI doesn't make you any less of a writer. Hard disagree, but you know, that's typical. What I didn't think he would do is try to convince me that using AI will make you better at writing. In reality, I've discovered that writing with AI actually makes you a better writer. It forces you to gain a deeper understanding of story structure, character development, pacing, and all the other intricacies that go into crafting a compelling book. That's in here, along with other things like how AI can help you study stories of your genre or suggest techniques and ideas you wouldn't have thought of. No thank you. I'll pass on the regurgitated info. I think I'll stick to actually knowing the source when I try to learn something. Now this next one made me think, what if he's the AI? Because he claims that AI allows more time for deliberate practice, since, ideally, authors should spend time in repetitive practice on a specific skill at a time. For example, writing the same scene over and over again with different tenses or points of view. I'm sorry, did you say ideally? Ideally. Did ChatGPT spit this one out? Otherwise, you can't convince me this guy doesn't have coding in his head. Who else but a machine thinks a human learns this way? Writing is inherently multifaceted. As you write, you're practicing several techniques at once. Like, you wouldn't practice chess by making the same move over and over again, right? You would practice by playing. Same with writing. It also just sounds boring. If you want to improve in writing, there's lots of ways to do so. Personal life experience, observation, reading, studying, but most importantly, there's writing. And you're not going to be doing that last one if you're using AI. Now, these points are mostly funny, but some parts of this book did leave me slightly irked. So he has this section where he bullet points different reasons you should use AI, and one of them is if you're neurodivergent. First of all, some of the best authors are neurodivergent. Beverly Cleary, a literal pioneer of children's literature, struggled with reading and writing as a kid. Second, nerdy. You don't have any of these conditions, so how can you recommend AI when you don't know how these conditions affect the writing process? For example, I'm dyslexic, right? So when I read, my eyes can jump over words and sentences. That's a part of the condition. So if someone was to ask me, what would you recommend for dyslexic writers? I would say text to speech, because it can read your work out for you, and then you can pick out mistakes that you would have otherwise missed. I would also recommend other things, but maybe that's for another video. The point I'm trying to make is, without knowing how these conditions work, how do you know AI would help? Another challenge for a lot of neurodivergent people when getting into something like writing is building up self-belief, because experiences in the education system have left them feeling undermined. If you think AI will help with that, it won't. It'll just reinforce this idea that you can't do it yourself. So this argument, when made by the pro-AI crowd, because Nerdy is not the first to say this, isn't actually to help neurodivergent people, it's to moral grandstand. It's meant to make you feel guilty for questioning AI's ethical practices. Not to take it personally, but it kinda stings. I'm tired of people using conditions and learning difficulties as a scapegoat. Okay, fine, I'm stepping off the soapbox. Let's get into some AI writing. Now, Nerdy has quite a few non-AI books out. We'll get to those later. But as far as his AI books go, they they're interesting. There's the children's book with the back being slightly unintelligible. There's also The Dawn of Ra, which according to its only review reads like AI. My real question is, why did you give it 4 stars then? But we're going to be taking a closer look at one of them called The Arthur Tales. But why bother? Because Nerdy claims in his videos that writing with AI is not lazy, as there's significant human input.
Even in instances where an author is using AI to do the bulk of the writing, it usually requires a heavy amount of editing after the fact to get it to a place where it is actually ready to be read and make coherent sense and have a style that's enjoyable and all of that.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What is the enjoyable standard for him? And also, is the editing that significant where the end result can only be his creative vision? Now this novel is a retelling of the stories of King Arthur. We're going to be looking at the first chapter where Arthur, his stepbrother Kay, and stepfather Sir Ector arrive at Londinium. We're just going to call it London. Side note, I dislike when stories of King Arthur take place in London. This is a pet peeve, not criticism on Nerdy, but it makes no sense. During this era, the Romans just had their own Brexit, leading to London being completely abandoned since it couldn't be supported on imports anymore. But because of 12th century writers and their biases, so many stories of King Arthur take place in London, including the most important one, where he pulls out the sword, becomes king. Anyway, the first chapter has a lot of issues, but we're going to focus on its weak narrative tone. There's a ton of reasons your writing can end up with a weak voice. Maybe your characters are underdeveloped, you might not know what your target audience is, or maybe you just don't have that confidence built up yet, so your prose come across as hesitant. In Nerdy's case, there's like 3 main reasons. They probably won't surprise you, so I'll get the most obvious out the way. There's lots of telling and very little showing. And I know some of you just rolled your eyes because if you spent any amount of time online, even slightly near the writing community, then you've been smacked in the face with the advice show don't tell more times than you can possibly count. But Nerdy over here just managed to duck and weave his way past all of this. Now obviously I should say there are times where telling makes complete sense, and I normally don't mind it at the start of a fantasy novel because that telling is usually world building or just stuff I need to know up front. Yeah, that isn't the case here. Most of chapter 1 is barely described, and when it is, it's all visual with none of the other senses, and we're never given specifics. Take this for example. The phrase crowded with people is too broad. More than Arthur has ever seen attempts to show skill, but tells more than it shows. Then there's the whether refugees, ambassadors, or merchants. It sets up a mix of characters, but feels like an exposition drop and has a formative list-like tone. If you want your audience to get an idea of what this is like, you have to describe it. Describe merchants barking out deals, or weary-eyed refugees clutching what little they own. Add some sensory details. Can we hear the hooves of horses on the stone roads? The rattle of wooden crates? Can we hear the jingle of keys or coins at the waist diplomats? What can we smell? Describe Arthur's reaction. Show us how much more this scene has to offer than the sleepy hamlets of the lake country. Sadly, this isn't the only example of this. There's the opening paragraph, the battlements, the towers. Yeah, what about them? There's also the random inclusion of Sir Ector's exercise routine. The AI or Nerdy doesn't seem to realise that you can't just bring things up out of nowhere. There needs to be cohesion. The second reason is repetition. There is so much stuff repeated in the first chapter that it almost felt intentional, like it was trying to annoy me. So there was the smaller stuff, like the same or similar word being used twice in close proximity. Then there was all the over-explaining. The AI or Nerdy feels the need to explain things we already know. His tone suggested he doubted the legends. Yeah, we can tell. Readers can pick up on implied meaning for the dialogue itself. If you really need to, add a physical cue or action. Don't just explain the dialogue. And if you are going to, can you spice up your wording a bit? Suggesting? Really? You also don't need to tell us that Arthur is interested in the legends. That's implied by him leaning forward when Sir Ector starts talking about them. You also don't need to tell us that Arthur prefers when Kay leaves him alone. We can pick up on the fact that they don't get along. The whole chapter has been them two not getting along. You don't need to remind us that Arthur is the runt of the family. We can tell based on how he is treated. Why is Arthur eating turkey when turkey wasn't introduced to Britain until the 1500s? Okay, that has nothing to do with redundancies. It just stood out to me. Anyway, I think you get my point. The third and final reason for the weak narrative tone is word choice. Something you may have noticed with all the examples I've shown is just how bland and stilted it all is. Large language models like ChatGPT are trained on text data like books, websites, news articles, scientific papers, and so on, leading to a much more academic style in its responses. And yes, it does take from some creative sources like novels, but those only make up a much smaller portion of the dataset. So even when it's specifically asked to emulate certain styles, It can adjust somewhat, but the model will rely on the phrasings it's most familiar with, often making it sound much more formal than an actual novel. I also think that no matter what you put in these models, it will always struggle with this because it lacks intent, which is such a key aspect of good word choice. When a writer knows exactly what they want a sentence, scene, or story to achieve, they can tailor their word choice to do so. Take this example from Game of Thrones.
The morning had dawned clear and cold, with a crispness that hinted at the end of summer. They set forth at daybreak to see a man beheaded, 20 in all, and Bran rode among them, nervous with excitement. This was the first time he had been deemed old enough to go with his Lord Father and his brothers to see the king's justice done. It was the 9th year of summer, and the 7th of Bran's life.
For word choice alone, we're immediately put into the type of setting that George R.R. Martin wants us to be in. I know that this is medieval. It's also just fun to read, which is like the whole point of writing. All three of these things lead to a weak narrative tone, which makes the AI writing not good. Also not worth reading. Hopefully I've made that point clear, but you may be left with more questions, because I was. Nerdy in his videos talks about all these different things you need to know to be able to write well with AI, but where is any of that? It's still AI trash. He also mentions being a professional writer with years of experience before AI came around, so I'm confused. Become his own experience isn't like kicking in for him to see these issues with the writing, so I needed to know what his editing process was. And then I found this video, where Nerdy shows us how to edit the AI writing and, in his own words,
What makes good writing?
he uses a software called AutoCrat, and by the looks of it, it just identifies issues with the writing, so I have no problem with it. Obviously, it's no replacement for a human editor, no writing assistant software is, for reasons I'm about to go into. For one, it can't seem to flag a lot of the clunky sentences, which there was a lot of on screen. They're not grammatically incorrect, they're just too wordy. Look at this example. Obviously, there's the usual issue with like the generic wording, but secondly, there's just too much happening here. This needs to be split into 2 sentences. AutoCrat also points out when the text is telling more than showing, and it does this by flagging certain words. This is a good way of spotting it, but even Nerdy admits it's not always accurate. From what I can see, it misses more subtle uses of telling that lack these keywords, and since the software isn't picking up on it, it seems Nerdy isn't either, which is why the problem exists in his book. But it also seems that it doesn't really matter if the software picks up on it or not, because Nerdy will ignore blatant examples of telling.
This first one, I can clearly see this is not an instance where I need to show more than tell.
Pause. Zoom in. Unfortunately for him, she has senses no one could possibly anticipate. Yeah, I would scrap this sentence. It's cliche, it's 100% telling rather than showing, and it's just plain redundant because the next line describes Mina using those senses. Also, the use of unfortunately. Ew. He also says this at one point.
Word choice is actually often very good because AI tends to diversify its word choice pretty well, often too well. At least more so than a human does.
You don't speak for humans, you're the AI! This video ended up confirming a lot of what I was thinking about. For one, the significant human editing he talks about in his videos just isn't there, but he still had a question mark on that title of established author. Now in this next video, he goes over some of his experience as a writer, even talks about one of his book series flopping and the burnout that caused, leading him to try out AI. I think this video is misleading because he leaves out a lot. I'm about to tell you his entire writing journey. According to his About Me section on his website and in his books, he originally wanted to be a filmmaker, as he was a pretty big Star Wars fan, even creating his own fan film at age 12. That part of his book reads a lot like, yeah, writing was a part of that. But look at these lightsabers. But this passion was sadly cut short when he got rejected twice from a films program at Brigham Young University. He then changed course to writing and did an English degree. Now this degree only covered a little of fiction writing, and he wasn't writing that much during this time because, according to him, he didn't want to be rejected from traditional publishing. Interesting, since writing doesn't have to be tied to publishing. Many writers just write for fun, long before they ever share their work. It wasn't until he discovered self-publishing later on that he wrote his first novel, Out of the Shadow, the start of an 8-book series called Roots of Creation, that he published over the course of a year, from July 2018 to August 2019. These are the many books he mentioned in the video that he uses to emphasize his experience and effort as a writer. While this is certainly prolific, 8 books in a year, each around 250 pages, that's going to come at the expense of quality, which it did, according to the mixed reviews. When taking a look at it myself, I did see an improvement in the opening of the last book compared to the first book, but it was still pretty poorly written. Speed in writing doesn't equate to skill. In many cases, it just reflects on a focus on output, which seems even more likely when he puts such a weight on commercial success.
And I was pretty tired from writing at this point, but I was really motivated because I was so sure that this series was going to make me the big bucks. Now, if you're familiar with success laws and things like that, you'll know that putting all of my faith on something being a moneymaker is a really bad way to start.
He then tried to write another series, 6 books this time. This is the one he talks about in his video.
So I'd written this book, and I had written the sequel, and I had prepared to release them very close to each other in this grand elaborate plan to have this really nice release plan. I was so certain it was going to work. I was halfway through writing this book, the 3rd book in the series, when I released these first 2. And what happened is, because I had my mind so set on the money, when these tanked, and boy did they tank, I was devastated.
On his website, he goes into more detail, stating, "I went all out on marketing. I created a website and wrote a ton of articles to try and attract readers of the genre. I took out a loan of $4,000 to spend on ads and promotional materials. I spared no expense on book covers and book descriptions. I was basically sure that this series would do much better than my first. As we already know, it did not. He released the first 2 books within a week of each other and both tanked. He was so devastated he couldn't continue working on book 3 and entered a deep state of writer's burnout. That's when ChatGPT came out, he became obsessed, and boom, YouTube channel." So several things to point out. I think he probably has, through trial and error, found out a lot about the sales and marketing of a book. But, and this might be presumptuous, I don't think he ever enjoyed
I
writing.
don't know what is motivating that person, but it's certainly not the joy of creating a story.
The way he talks about it, it comes across as a mandatory part of the process, something he doesn't like, but he needs to do it as it's the best way to achieve his goal, to one day make a movie. I think that's why he burnt out so fast. Yes, he did have a massive focus on the financial success, so when it wasn't met, he was disappointed. I believe him when he says that, but I also think that you don't rush out books that quickly if you're someone who wants to hone their craft or have an interest in the writing itself. I believe that AI wasn't a savior for writer's block. It's a tool to get him past the activity he previously had to tolerate, actually writing. I also think it's really dishonest to present yourself as a professional writer when you're better described as a struggling self-published author. You didn't have years of experience, you had a single year of rapidly pumping out books. Nerdy must know that his audience eats it up, because what's a better way of confirming that using AI still makes you a legitimate writer than having a professional give it that air of credibility? But it doesn't make you a writer. It can't even write well. AI can only turn storytelling into a factory line of rapid, uninspired output. It doesn't elevate a writer's work, it dilutes it. Yet creators like Nerdy may never notice, confusing surface level fluency with genuine quality, because he never took the time to get better at it. That's why he can't see the issues with the AI writing. And that's probably why many AI users can't. They would rather take a shortcut than put in the work to learn. And yes, Nerdy, that makes you lazy.
And if the resulting text is soulless and lacks that human edge, that really is going to be on the part of the author, showing that they didn't edit or they didn't guide it well enough, which is really no different than an author who just isn't a good writer, who's just putting out stuff without any effort.